In Salem, Oregon, there was an institution where the only way out was through the operating room. For more than 50 years, the superintendent of Fairview Training Center sat on the state's Board of Eugenics. The board had a rule. If you wanted to leave, you had to be sterilized first. Not asked, not counseled, sedated and cut. The last time it happened was 1981. The institution that charged this price had a name. For most of its existence, Oregonians simply called it Fairview. It sat on 670 acres of farmland just south of the state capitol building, close enough that legislators could have seen it from their office windows. Most of them never looked. The state bought the land from local farm families in 1907, then sent 20 inmates from the Oregon State Penitentiary to build the first structures: a dormitory, an administration building, a laundry, and a boiler house. Fairview opened on December 1st, 1908, with 39 people transferred from the Oregon State Hospital. The first resident had arrived the night before, a 9-year-old boy named Jack Broderick. His paperwork listed him as feeble-minded. That was the language of the time. It meant whatever the state wanted it to mean. Oregon was late to this. By 1908, 33 institutions for people classified as feeble-minded already existed across 22 states. But Oregon built fast, and it built on a particular model. Fairview was not a single massive building in the style of the old asylums. It was a colony, a cluster of residential cottages spread across rolling terrain, surrounded by working farmland. 400 acres were in crops, and 45 acres were orchards. The residents worked the fields. The institution called them students, and it called the work training. The people who picked the fruit, fed the livestock, and tended the crops were never paid a cent for any of it. For a while, the colony pretended to be a school. Classes ran 3 hours a day. Students exhibited their work at the Oregon State Fair. But by the late 1920s, the pretense had worn through. A 1929 promotional document stopped trying altogether and stated plainly that the feeble-minded child can never become independently self-supporting. The school was a warehouse with a garden. By 1933, only 70 of the roughly 1,000 residents were considered capable of learning anything at all. The rest were classified as custodial. They were there to be stored. And it was around this time that the institution revealed what it actually was. Not a school, not a hospital, not a home. It was a gate. The gate had a lock, and the key was a scalpel. Oregon passed its first forced sterilization law in 1913, signed by the governor himself. It lasted less than a year. A woman named Laura Little organized the first anti-sterilization advocacy group in American history and forced a public referendum. Oregon citizens voted the law down by a margin of more than 11,000 votes. It is worth pausing on that. The people said no. The legislature did not care. A second sterilization law passed in 1917. A third passed in 1923. The third law created the Oregon Board of Eugenics and placed the superintendent of Fairview on the board as a permanent member. Think about what that means. The person running the institution was also the person deciding who inside it would be allowed to have children. By 1929, 300 Fairview residents had been sterilized. The procedures included vasectomies, castrations, tubal ligations, and hysterectomies. Oregon went further than most states in how often it chose castration over vasectomy, particularly for men accused of homosexuality. Then, in 1931, the institution formalized what had already been practiced for years. Sterilization became an official condition of parole. 2/3 of paroled residents underwent the procedure before they were permitted to walk out the door. Teenagers were injected with sedatives and operated on without understanding what was being done to their bodies. It was not a suggestion, and it was not optional. It was the price of leaving. One family was given the choice directly. Their daughter could remain locked inside Fairview for the rest of her life, or she could be sterilized and released. Her father chose the surgery. He chose it so she could come home. Her name was Ruth Morris. She was one of thousands who faced this transaction, and we will hear from her again before this story ends. This is the point where most people assume the timeline bends, where they expect to hear that this happened in the 1930s or the 1940s and was later abandoned as the country moved forward. But the eugenics law was not repealed until 1983. The last forced sterilization at Fairview was performed in 1981. That was the same year the first space shuttle launched. It was the same year MTV went on the air. This is not ancient history. This happened in a world that looked a lot like this one. Over the full span of the program, the state of Oregon sterilized 2,648 people. 1,713 of them were women. 935 were men. The superintendent of Fairview sat on the board that authorized every single one. If you were never taught any of this, you are not alone. Most people were not. And that silence is worth sitting with. I would like to hear your thoughts on that in the comments. Through the Depression, through the Second World War, through the post-war boom, Fairview kept growing. New cottages went up. New departments were added. The population climbed year after year with no sign of slowing. By the early 1960s, more than 2,700 residents lived in 61 buildings spread across 275 acres. Cottages designed to house 75 people routinely held 100 or more. 500 people sat on a waiting list, sometimes for 2 years or longer. The institution that was built to hold hundreds now held thousands. And the question that follows is the one nobody at the time was willing to answer honestly. What did it look like inside those cottages when nobody from the outside was watching? The problems were not new. They had been building for decades. As early as 1946, a Salem newspaper described buildings that were antiquated structures bulging with patients, with conditions that would cause a riot at state prison. The staffing ratio at the time was 1 employee for every 85 residents. 1 person responsible for 85 human beings. Meals were prepared in bulk and shoveled into residents' mouths with oversized spoons as fast as physically possible because there simply were not enough hands to slow down. Some children inhaled the food. They developed aspiration pneumonia from it. Some of them died. The discipline was physical and it was constant. Leather cuffs, razor straps. One former resident recalled being suspended in a laundry bag hung from a pipe in the ceiling, not during a crisis, as routine punishment. By the 1980s, conditions had not meaningfully improved. A graduate student assigned to Fairview publicly described what she witnessed there. Residents handcuffed to 60-pound concrete blocks and forced to push them up and down the hallways. Staff punished residents who soiled themselves with cold baths. Others were placed in water hot enough to scald their skin. Some residents were drugged and physically restrained at the same time. There were rooms the staff called time-out rooms. The last superintendent, John Cooper, later confirmed that those rooms were cages. Cooper also confirmed something else. During a period of reform in the 1980s, the administration deliberately destroyed every photograph of its restraint devices and isolation equipment. They did not archive the images. They did not seal them. They burned them. Then came the night of the fire. On a December evening in 1969, flames broke out in Bird Cottage. 3 residents died. 9 were injured. The people living in Bird Cottage were physically disabled. Many of them slept in oversized cribs, restrained so they could not get out on their own. When the fire spread, staff tried to pull those cribs through the doorways. The cribs did not fit. They were too wide. 3 people burned to death in beds they could not leave, in a building they could not escape, in an institution they had never chosen to enter. After the fire, the state investigated. Policies were reviewed. Some changes were made. And Fairview continued operating for another 31 years. In May of 1983, the United States Department of Justice opened a formal civil rights investigation into conditions at Fairview. What federal investigators found was devastating. Though to anyone who had been paying attention, it should not have been surprising. 70% of residents had gum disease. The average wait for dental treatment requiring anesthesia was 2.5 years. 40% of examined residents had pressure sores. More than 70% received no individualized training programs of any kind. In some cottages, 15 to 20 residents had no direct care staff present at all. The Department of Justice published its findings in March of 1986. The language was unambiguous. Conditions at Fairview violated the constitutional rights of its residents. The federal government filed suit that July. Federal regulators followed with their own review and decertified the institution entirely. Medicaid funding, which covered up to 60% of operating costs, was cut for 14 weeks. The state lost an estimated $7 to $8 million. A consent decree followed in 1989. Oregon pledged roughly $30 million in improvements, new staff, new programs, upgraded facilities. The federal government had found conditions unconstitutional, and the state spent $30 million to prove the institution could work. It would close less than a decade later. That is not a failure of investment. It is the clearest possible proof that the institution itself was the problem. But before any of that came to pass, the institution had already failed one of its residents in a way that no consent decree could fix. On March 9, 1979, an 18-year-old woman named Janie Landers walked away from the Fairview grounds. Janie had lived at Fairview since childhood. She functioned at the level of an 8-year-old. She was not violent. She was not trying to escape. She simply walked away. Nobody stopped her. 5 days later, her body was found in a wooded area near Silver Falls State Park, 24 miles from Salem. She had suffered blunt force trauma and multiple stab wounds. The case went cold. It stayed cold for 38 years. Janie's sister, a woman named Joyce Caldwell, never stopped pressing investigators to solve it. She called, she wrote, she waited for almost 4 decades. In 2017, DNA recovered from Janie Landers' clothing was matched to a man named Gerald Kenneth Dunlap. Dunlap had worked at Fairview. He was a laundry room employee. What the state of Oregon did not know when it hired him, because it never bothered to check, was that Gerald Dunlap had been convicted of rape in Tennessee in 1961. He had been sentenced to 99 years in prison. He was paroled after 12 years. He moved to Oregon in 1974. He applied for a job at a state institution that housed thousands of people with intellectual disabilities, and he was hired without a background check of any kind. Dunlap was eventually fired from Fairview in 1983 for inappropriate behavior toward women on the grounds. He was later convicted of sexually abusing a minor family member in 1996 and sent to prison, where he died in 2002. When the DNA results came back 15 years after his death, the case was finally closed. No one was ever prosecuted. Joyce Caldwell had her answer. It had taken 38 years. Janie Landers was not killed because one bad person got through the door. She was killed because the institution did not believe the people inside were worth protecting with a basic screening process. The same institution that had sterilized its residents for decades. The same institution that had burned its own photographs rather than let anyone see what it did to them. In 1994, 11 Fairview employees were indicted on criminal charges of physically abusing residents. Prosecution was difficult. The victims had intellectual disabilities, and most could not testify effectively in court. A code of silence among staff made building cases nearly impossible. Of 82 total charges, only 9 resulted in guilty verdicts. The institution that had been open since 1908 was running out of justifications. But it was not the moral argument that finally closed Fairview, not the fires, not the lawsuits, not the indictments. It was the math. By 1996, approximately 300 residents remained. Those 300 people consumed 30% of Oregon's entire budget for developmental disability services. Meanwhile, more than 3,000 Oregonians with disabilities sat on a waitlist for community-based services, receiving nothing at all. The cost to keep one person at Fairview approached $200,000 per year, 30% of the money for 3% of the people. The moral case had been made for decades. It was the spreadsheet that finally won. The Oregon legislature adopted a closure plan in 1997 and set a deadline of July 2000. John Cooper became the last superintendent. He later said he would not have accepted the position if the goal had not been to close the place. Each of the remaining residents received an individual transition plan. Living arrangements on campus were reconfigured to mirror the community homes residents would move into. Staff who had spent years at Fairview moved with their residents into those new homes, preserving relationships that had formed under circumstances nobody would have chosen. The last 4 residents left Fairview in a blue van in late February of 2000. The doors were closed for good on March 1st. 92 years after Jack Broderick walked in at the age of 9, the last person walked out. But closing the building did not settle the debt. On December 2, 2002, Governor John Kitzhaber stood at the Oregon State Capitol and delivered a formal apology for the state's eugenics program. He named the numbers. 2,648 people were sterilized between 1917 and 1981. He acknowledged what the institution had been. He acknowledged what the state had done. Oregon was the second state to formally apologize after Virginia. Then a woman stepped to the microphone. Her name was Ruth Morris, the same Ruth Morris whose father had chosen surgery so that she could come home, the same woman who had been cut open so she could be free. She stood in the same building where the laws had been written, and she said, "I was one of the people that was forcibly sterilized. I did not have a choice." Near her stood Kenneth Newman, sterilized at Fairview at the age of 15. His wife Shirley had also been sterilized there. He told reporters that it knocked him backward. Iva Gray, another former resident, had been forced to undergo the procedure before she was permitted to leave. She married Ted McNeil, who had also been sterilized as a teenager at Fairview. They were married for 34 years. Neither of them ever had the family that freedom should have made possible. Today, the 670 acres that once held Fairview are barely recognizable. Every cottage has been demolished. Not one original residential building survives. Arsonists set fire to one of the last standing cottages in 2010. The rest were torn down by 2016. No building on the property was ever granted historic landmark status. There was no preservation debate. The campus was simply cleared from the landscape. On the land where the institution once operated, families now live in a sustainable housing development with energy-efficient homes. Children play on the ground where cottages once held residents who were handcuffed to concrete blocks as punishment. On another section of the property, the city of Salem is building a 26-acre public park. The Oregon legislature has funded an interpretive space on the grounds where visitors will learn what happened on the soil beneath their feet. The park is expected to open in 2027, over a century after the first cottage was built by prison inmates. And here is what makes Oregon's transformation different from most states that simply closed their institutions and moved on. After Fairview shut down, disability rights advocates filed a lawsuit on behalf of more than 7,000 people who were still on the wait list for community services. The settlement created a statewide system of community-based supports that had not existed before. Oregon eventually became one of the few states in the country with no remaining state-run institutions for people with intellectual or developmental disabilities. A state that once required surgical sterilization as the price of freedom now has no institutional walls left at all. The distance between those two facts is measured in more than a century. It is measured in what a government was willing to do to the people it considered less than whole, and in what it later chose to become when it finally had to face what it had done. Roughly 10,000 people passed through Fairview Training Center across its 92 years of operation. Most of their names appear in no archive. Most of their stories were never recorded, and the people who ran this place understood that. They understood it well enough to burn the photographs. The question is whether the rest of us are willing to remember what they tried so hard to erase. If this story stayed with you, I want to hear from you. When the buildings are gone and the records are destroyed, what does accountability look like? What is owed to the people who are no longer alive to hear the apology? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if this is your first time here, this channel covers the history of America's forgotten institutions, the places most people never learned about and most textbooks never mention. There are more stories waiting.